Thank you very much. I carry a very difficult message because I'm coming from a global perspective, and it's the perspective that I believe is absolutely essential for us to have clarity about the way forward and clarity about why the economics of happiness fundamentally has to do with bringing the economy home, shortening distances, or localizing. It's when you see at a global level, and by that I mean having worked in the less developed world, in the least developed world, like Bhutan and Ladakh, Nepal, and have grown up in Scandinavia, lived in America, seen different flavors of industrial modernity, that a different picture emerges. Above all, what you see is that in the name of progress, people are running faster and faster and faster, and they have been trained to look at the world through narrower and narrower lenses, and they're more and more caught up inside a big system that they no longer see. It is interesting that in the less developed world, people will talk about we are being developed. But in the industrialized world, people tend to treat change as some kind of evolutionary progress. They no longer look at the economic development that's being imposed on them without any discussion in the political debate. We don't get asked about how we want money to be created. Most people don't even know that it is being created, and really out of thin air. And we don't realize that it's not being created by our governments, and we're not aware of who is it that's deciding how much money should flow through our system. We actually have, in our daily lives, we are now being run by a robot. Essentially, it's an algorithm that every day decides the price of things in the marketplace. How do we get into this situation? That is where we must look, particularly since the Second World War, at a whole series of treaties which were brought in often through good intentions. The intentions after the Second World War was to try to prevent another depression. It was to try to integrate economic activity worldwide. Well, guess what? That integration meant that our governments were giving more and more power to global banks and corporations, handing over more and more and more power, creating a red carpet of global infrastructure. And we're now today in a situation where virtually everywhere on the planet the local infrastructure is neglected, but we're spending quadrillions to build up global infrastructures, including the satellites and so on, that service and support the global monopolies that, by the way, don't pay tax. In the meanwhile, local communities and local governments, national governments, are being impoverished relative to the wealth that's growing. We do hear about those 8 men who own more wealth than half the global population, but we don't talk nearly enough about those corporations that are an institution, a sort of profit-making machine. The raison d'être is profit. And yes, you can have good leadership in Unilever, in Coca-Cola, in Monsanto. You can have decent people, and in fact you often do. You know, I meet them often, and they are not the psychopaths that are often being described at the grassroots. They're often not that different from the people who own a small corner shop. But they are running an institution that has become a dangerous money-making machine. And those dangerous money-making machines need to be regulated. But instead what's happened is that they're being consistently, through a multitude of different treaties, both multilateral and bilateral, they are being given more freedom. In those treaties, there are now clauses called ISDS clauses, investor-state dispute settlements. And they are saying in black and white, governments have to sign that they will not do anything that would impede the profit-making of foreign corporations and investors. If they do, they'll be taken to court. So you have a Swedish nuclear power company called Vattenfall, Waterfall, suing Germany for 3.7 billion euros because Germany decided to phase out nuclear power after Fukushima. Now, understanding that makes it so clear why the economics of happiness is fundamentally about taking back the power, shortening the distances. We don't want to be flying fish to China to be deboned, or flying our apples to South Africa to be washed. We don't want to have identical products imported and exported. We want to shorten those distances. The demand for local is huge, which is why many big corporations are now masquerading as local. HSBC, the world's local bank, bending over backwards because we are waking up. But we need to talk more about that bigger picture at the top, and we need to see the link to that system and to every crisis that Jonathan mentioned. And the one that you might not have mentioned is what I have lived through, which is in the less industrialized world, where there is still more of a local identity, more religious, cultural, linguistic diversity. This economic system imposes so much competition and fear, as well as destroying individual cultural identities. It destroys diversity. It's a system that cannot tolerate diversity, imposing a consumer monoculture identity. So in those cultures, one of the responses is local ethnic friction, violence, and terrorism. So almost every major crisis we face has to do with this out-of-control, deregulated global economy. How do we bring it back? We are bringing it back already. As Liz mentioned, there's so much happening at the local level, and there's so much more than you know, because we don't get to hear about it in the media. Jonathan Dimbleby, help us. We can report on a multitude of businesses linked to local consumers. We can report on local finance, as Michael Schumann will do later. We can report on a chorus of highly educated, respected economists spelling out very clearly the need for change, and more they're recognizing that it needs to be about rebuilding local economies, shortening distances, rebuilding social cohesion. There are studies that show what happens in communities dominated by absentee, distant ownership versus what happens in communities where there are local businesses that help to create the real human interdependence and the interdependence with local resources. Those studies were even there in the 1940s, and they showed very clearly how the social cohesion, essentially the well-being of individuals and societies increased when they had business economic structures integrated into society. The businesses that were servicing them, that were providing for them, actually responding to the needs of the local place. And we're talking about both ecological needs and social needs. Human and ecological well-being, as we know, completely linked. And my experience, Jonathan, in terms of happiness, is that we are talking about a contentment that means that suicide, anxiety and depression among young people, fear and xenophobia, these things are largely absent in societies of contentment, societies that manage to fulfill people's deepest needs for connection, connection to each other, connection to the living world around them. There is a way forward in which we can slow down, in which we can actually liberate ourselves from even, the ignorance of Joseph Stiglitz, who believes that to create jobs, we need more technology. A 5-year-old child would say, wait a minute, I thought technology was taking over functions that humans fulfill. So is really more technology what we need to create jobs? No, we need to be liberated to do those jobs that we all know are required for a caring, happy society. Thank you.